Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. When you hear the word Renaissance, what comes to mind? Probably names like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and the sun-drenched cities of Florence and Rome, right? But what if I told you there was another equally brilliant Renaissance happening at the same time, hundreds of miles to the north? Tonight, we're journeying beyond Italy to explore the fascinating, complex, and utterly unique world of the Northern Renaissance. From the meticulous oil paintings of Jan van Eyck to the groundbreaking ideas of Erasmus and the timeless plays of a certain William Shakespeare, we're about to uncover a revolution in art, thought, and culture that shaped the modern world in ways you might not expect. So, grab your virtual passport and let's head north. The Italian Renaissance, which we've talked about before, was a rebirth of classical Greek and Roman ideals. It was all about humanism, perfect proportions, and grand, idealized beauty. The Northern Renaissance, which flourished in places like the Netherlands, Germany, France, and England, shared this spirit of renewal but had its own distinct flavor. Why the difference? Well, for one, the North didn't have a direct backyard full of Roma ruins to inspire them. Their artistic traditions were rooted more in the intricate details of Gothic art. Plus, society was different. While Italian art was often funded by powerful families like the Medici or the Pope, Northern art was frequently commissioned by a rising class of wealthy merchants and bankers. These patrons wanted art that reflected their own world, their homes, their possessions, and their personal piety. And now, before your mind drifts deeper into this peaceful journey, take just a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Because every night, with true stories from the Renaissance, you'll fall asleep calmer, deeper, and more at peace. This created a demand for a very different kind of art, one focused on realism, everyday life, and a deep, often somber, spirituality. Let's start with the rock star of the early Northern Renaissance, Jan van Eyck. Active in the early 15th century in the wealthy city of Bruges, Van Eyck was a master of a revolutionary new medium, oil paint. While Italians were primarily using tempera and fresco, which dry quickly, oil paint allowed for an unprecedented level of detail and luminosity. Van Eyck could layer translucent glazes of color to create incredibly realistic textures, the gleam of metal, the softness of fur, the reflection in a mirror. Just look at his masterpiece, the Arnolfini portrait. This isn't just a painting of a wealthy couple, it's a document. Every single object is rendered with painstaking precision, from the wooden clogs on the floor to the single candle burning in the chandelier. And in the mirror on the back wall, you can see the reflection of the entire room, including two other figures, one of whom is likely Van Eyck himself. This intense focus on detail and symbolism, what we call disguised symbolism, where everyday objects hold deeper religious meaning, is a hallmark of Northern art. As we move into the 16th century, the scene shifts to Germany, and we meet another giant. Albrecht Dürer was a true Renaissance man. He was a brilliant painter, but he's perhaps even more famous for his work in printmaking, woodcuts, and engraving. Think of him as the first artist to truly understand mass media. He could create an incredibly detailed image, like his famous rhinoceros, and then print hundreds of copies, spreading his art and fame across Europe. He was also a traveler and a scholar. He journeyed to Italy twice, soaking up the lessons of Italian perspective and proportion, and then brilliantly blended them with the Northern tradition of intense detail and psychological depth. His self-portraits are legendary. He painted himself with the confidence and introspection of a modern artist, presenting himself not just as a craftsman, but as a noble, intellectual creator. But the Northern Renaissance wasn't just about art. It was a time of profound intellectual and religious upheaval, and no one embodies this more than Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, a scholar, priest, and writer. Erasmus was the leading figure of what we call Christian humanism. Like the Italian humanists, he was passionate about studying classical texts, but he applied that same critical method to the Bible and the writings of the early church fathers. His goal: to reform the Catholic Church from within, to strip away centuries of what he saw as superstition and corruption and return to a simpler, more authentic form of Christianity. His most famous work, In Praise of Folly, is a satirical masterpiece that wittily criticizes the foolishness and arrogance of all levels of society, especially the clergy. Erasmus's call for reform and his emphasis on personal faith laid crucial groundwork for the massive religious earthquake that was just around the corner: the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation, kicked off by Martin Luther in 1517, had a massive impact on the Northern Renaissance. Suddenly, the religious unity of Europe was shattered. In Protestant regions, the demand for traditional religious art like altarpieces and paintings of saints, this forced artists to explore new subjects. We see the rise of portraiture, landscapes, and scenes of everyday life, known as genre painting. One of the greatest masters of this was Peter Bruegel the Elder. Bruegel painted lively, sprawling scenes filled with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of ordinary people working, celebrating, and just living their lives. Look at the peasant wedding or children's games. These aren't idealized scenes. They're bustling, energetic, and sometimes chaotic depictions of village life. Bruegel observed the world around him with a keen, often humorous eye, capturing the rhythm of the seasons and the human condition. He showed that the lives of common folk were a worthy subject for great art. And finally, we crossed the English Channel to England during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. The English Renaissance found its ultimate expression not in painting, but in literature and theater. And at the heart of it all stands William Shakespeare. What Van Eyck did with paint and Dürer with print, Shakespeare did with words. He took the English language and stretched it to its limits, inventing new words and crafting phrases that we still use today. His plays, from comedies like A Midsummer Night, Dream, to towering tragedies like Hamlet and King Lear, explore the entire spectrum of human experience: love, jealousy, ambition, grief, and joy. He drew on classical sources, English history, and contemporary life, weaving them all into timeless stories. Just like the Northern painters focused on psychological realism, Shakespeare created characters with incredible depth and complexity. His work is the crowning achievement of the Northern Renaissance, a testament to its enduring fascination with the individual and the intricacies of the human heart. So, while the Italian Renaissance was giving us the divine beauty of David and the Sistine Chapel, the Northern Renaissance was giving us something different, but no less profound. It was a renaissance of meticulous observation, of deep psychological insight, and of a growing interest in the lives of ordinary people. It gave us the luminous realism of oil paint, the democratic power of the printed image, the intellectual courage of Christian humanism, and the timeless poetry of Shakespeare. It's a story of how a continent reinvented itself, not just by looking back to an ancient past, but by looking closely at the world right in front of it, and at the complex inner worlds of its people. The legacy of the Northern Renaissance is all around us in our art, our literature, and our very way of thinking. Renaissance in Spain and the Netherlands. We've spent a lot of time in Italy, marveling at Michelangelo and Leonardo, but the Renaissance wasn't just an Italian bloc party. This incredible wave of artistic and intellectual rebirth swept across Europe, And today, we're heading north and west to explore two fascinatingly different, yet equally brilliant versions of the Renaissance. One in Spain and the other in the Netherlands. So, let's start with Spain. Picture this. The late 15th century, Spain has just wrapped up the Reconquista, uniting under the powerful Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. There's a surge of national pride, immense wealth flowing in from the New World, and a deeply rooted, passionate Catholic faith. This combination created a unique environment for the Spanish Renaissance. It wasn't about rediscovering classical pagan myths like in Italy. Instead, Spanish artists took the techniques of the Italian masters-like perspective and realistic human anatomy and used them to express intense religious devotion. The undisputed king of this movement wasn't even Spanish by birth. It was a Greek painter named Dominikos Theotokopoulos, but we know him as El Greco, the Greek. When El Greco arrived in Spain, he found the perfect home for his incredibly unique style. He wasn't just painting saints, he was painting their souls. Look at his famous work, The Burial of the Count of Vogaz. The lower half is grounded and realistic, depicting the funeral on earth. But the upper half, it's a swirling, mystical vision of heaven. The figures are elongated, almost stretched towards the divine. The colors are electric and otherworldly. El Greco used distortion, not because he couldn't paint realistically, but to convey a spiritual ecstasy that was beyond everyday reality. His work is pure emotion, a direct line to the divine passion that defined the Spanish Golden Age. Spanish architecture also got a Renaissance makeover, but again, with a distinct twist. They developed a style called plateresque. The name comes from platero, meaning silversmith, and that's exactly what it looks like. Buildings, especially their facades, are covered in incredibly intricate, delicate, and lavish decorations, almost like a giant piece of silverware. It combined Gothic structures with Renaissance motifs, but with a level of ornamentation that was uniquely Spanish. It was a declaration of wealth, power, and faith, all carved in stone. Now, let's pack our bags and travel north to the Netherlands. The vibe here couldn't be more different. While Spain was a unified Catholic monarchy, the Netherlands was a bustling hub of commerce and trade made up of increasingly prosperous merchant cities, and, crucially, it was undergoing the Protestant Reformation. This had a massive impact on art. The Protestant church was wary of religious idols, so the demand for huge, dramatic altarpieces plummeted. So, what did artists do? They turned their attention to the world around them. If the Spanish Renaissance was about looking up to heaven, the Northern Renaissance was about looking right in front of you. This is where we see the birth of genres that we still love today. Portraits, landscapes, and still lifes. The new patrons of art weren't kings or popes. They were wealthy bankers, cloth merchants, and guild members who wanted to see themselves, their families, and their comfortable lives immortalized in paint. One of the early pioneers of this new style was Jan van Eyck. Technically, he was a bit before the High Renaissance, but his influence was enormous. He was a master of oil paint, using it to create textures and light with a level of detail that was simply Look at his Arnolfini portrait. Every single object in the room tells a story. The reflection in the mirror, the texture of the fur on the man's coat, the single candle burning in the chandeliers, all rendered with breathtaking precision. It's a celebration of a domestic, prosperous life, filled with subtle symbolism. A century later, we get another giant of the Northern Renaissance, Peter Bruegel the Elder. Bruegel wasn't interested in painting wealthy merchants in their fancy homes. He was the painter of the people. His work is filled with peasants, villages, and everyday life. He shows them working, celebrating, dancing, and just living. His paintings, like the peasant wedding or hunters in the snow, are like a Where's Waldo of the 16th century Flemish life. You can spend hours looking at them, discovering tiny, fascinating details and little stories playing out in every corner. Bruegel gave dignity and importance to the lives of ordinary people, something that was truly revolutionary for his time. And we can't talk about the Northern Renaissance without mentioning Hieronymus Bosch. Bosch was something else entirely. While his contemporaries were painting realistic scenes, Bosch was painting nightmares and dreams. His most famous work, The Garden of Earthly Delights, is a triptych that shows the Garden of Eden, a chaotic scene of worldly pleasure and a terrifying vision of hell. It's filled with bizarre creatures, strange contraptions, and surreal imagery that artists are still trying to decode today. Was it a warning against sin? A complex allegory? We don't really know. But it shows the incredible creativity and imaginative freedom that also characterized the Northern Renaissance. He was like a surrealist painter for 100 years ahead of his time. So, when we compare the two, we see two powerful streams flowing from the same Italian source, but carving very different riverbeds. The Spanish Renaissance was grand, dramatic, and deeply spiritual, fueled by the power of the Catholic Church and the monarchy. It used Renaissance techniques to explore the mysteries of faith. The Dutch and Flemish Renaissance, on the other hand, was intimate, detailed, and focused on the real world. Fueled by a rising merchant class and the Reformation, it found beauty and meaning in everyday life, in the face of a neighbor, the light in a room, or the landscape outside the window. El Greco's elongated saints stretching towards heaven, and Bruegel's peasants dancing at a village festival. Both are masterpieces of the Renaissance, but they speak in completely different languages. One speaks of spiritual ecstasy, the other of earthly existence. Together, they show us just how rich, diverse, and adaptable this incredible period of history truly was. It wasn't a single monolithic event, but a collection of brilliant cultural flowerings, each shaped by its own unique soil and climate. We're diving deep into one of history's most fascinating connections, how the dazzling explosion of art, science, and ideas known as the Renaissance directly paved the way for the earth-shattering religious upheaval of the Protestant Reformation. It's a story of how rediscovering the past completely reshaped the future. So, close your eyes, relax, drift into sleep, and let's travel back to the past together. To really get this, we first need to understand the world just before the Renaissance. For centuries, Europe was dominated by the Catholic Church. It wasn't just a religious institution. It was the central authority in politics, culture, and daily life. Knowledge was concentrated within the clergy, and the official language of scholarship and the Bible was Latin, a language most ordinary people couldn't read or understand. This created a huge gap between the church hierarchy and the common person. Faith was often based on tradition and the word of the priest, not personal study. The world was seen through a very specific, church-approved lens. But deep in the heart of Italy, the seeds of a monumental change were being sown. Starting in the 14th century, something incredible began to happen. Scholars, artists, and thinkers in places like Florence and Rome started looking way back to the classical worlds of ancient Greece and Rome. They were captivated by the philosophy, art, literature, and political ideas of figures like Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero. This wasn't just about admiring old statues. It was a profound shift in mindset. This rebirth, or renaissance, championed a new philosophy, humanism. Humanism placed a revolutionary new emphasis on human potential, individual achievement, and critical thinking. Instead of just accepting dogma, humanists believed in questioning, investigating, and using reason to understand the world. The motto of the era, ad fontes, which means back to the sources, became their rallying cry. They believed that to find true knowledge, you had to go back to the original texts, not just to rely on centuries of commentary and interpretation that might have distorted the original meaning. This idea, as we'll see, would have explosive consequences when applied to religion. So, how did this intellectual curiosity lead to a full-blown religious revolution? It started with a new tool, the printing press. Invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, this machine was the internet of its day. Suddenly, books and pamphlets could be mass-produced cheaply and quickly. Ideas, which once spread at the speed of a horse-drawn cart, could now fly across Europe. The printing press broke the monopoly on information that the church had held for 1,000 years. It democratized knowledge, and one of the first and most important books to be printed was, you guessed it, the Bible. Now, combine this new technology with the humanist passion for ad fontes. Scholars like Desiderius, a giant of Northern Renaissance humanism, took this principle to heart. He embarked on a monumental task to create a new, more accurate translation of the New Testament from its original Greek. His 1516 publication was a bombshell. By comparing the original Greek texts to the commonly used Latin Vulgate Bible, Erasmus exposed numerous translation errors and inconsistencies that had been part of church doctrine for centuries. For example, he pointed out that the Greek word metanoite, which Jesus uses to begin his ministry, was better translated as repent or change one's mind rather than the Latin penitentium ascici, which implied dupe penance. This might seem like a small detail, but it was huge. It shifted the focus from performing external acts of penance, often controlled by the church, to an internal personal transformation of the heart and mind. Erasmus, though he remained a Catholic, had cracked open the door. He showed that the sacred text itself could and should be scrutinized, and that the church's interpretation wasn't necessarily infallible. This intellectual environment was a perfect stage for a certain German monk named Martin Luther. Luther was himself a product of the humanist university system, trained to analyze texts critically. When he began to question the church's practice of selling indulgences certificates, said to reduce time in purgatory, he did so with the confidence of a humanist scholar. He went back to the sources. He dove into the Bible, particularly the writings of the Apostle Paul in their original languages. What he found there, he believed, was a message of salvation through faith alone, solidified not through good works or church-sanctioned penance. This was a direct challenge to the entire church system, which was built on mediating God's grace through sacraments, priests, and payments. In 1517, when Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, he wasn't just being defiant. He was participating in a scholarly debate armed with the tools of Renaissance humanism, and thanks to the printing press. His arguments didn't stay in Wittenberg. They were printed, reprinted, and distributed across Germany and beyond within weeks, igniting a firestorm. The Renaissance, focused on individualism, also played a crucial role. Before, a person's identity was largely tied to their community, their village. their guild, their parish. The Renaissance celebrated the unique individual, the Renaissance man, a person of many talents and curiosities. This new sense of self-worth translated directly into the religious sphere. The Protestant idea of the priesthood of all believers was revolutionary. It argued that every individual could have a direct relationship with God without needing a priest as an intermediary. Every person could read and interpret the Bible for themselves. This was the ultimate expression of religious individualism, an idea that would have been almost unthinkable just a couple of 100 years earlier. Furthermore, the spirit of inquiry that defined the Renaissance didn't just apply to ancient texts. It fostered a broader skepticism towards established authority. As scientists like Copernicus and Galileo began to question the Church's understanding of the cosmos, it became clear that even long-held truths could be challenged and overturned by evidence and reason. This created a culture where questioning the Pope's authority wasn't just heresy, it was a legitimate intellectual position. If the Church could be wrong about the heavens, could it also be wrong about the path to salvation? The political landscape, too, was shifting. Renaissance-era kings and princes were consolidating their power and building stronger, centralized states. They grew resentful of the immense wealth and political influence the Church held within their lands. When the Reformation began, many of these secular rulers saw an opportunity. By breaking with Rome, they could seize Church lands, stop sending money to the Vatican, and assert their own authority over religious matters in their territory. The Reformation gave them a powerful religious and intellectual justification for what was also a very practical political and economic move. So, when you look at the big picture, the connection is crystal clear. The Renaissance wasn't the Reformation, but it created the conditions that made the Reformation possible, even inevitable. It provided the intellectual tools like textual criticism and humanism. It provided the technological means, the printing press, to spread new ideas like wildfire. And it fostered a new cultural mindset that valued individualism, skepticism, and a direct personal search for truth. Without the Renaissance's call to go back to the sources, Martin Luther might never have found the scriptural basis for his theology. Without the printing press, his 95 Theses might have been a local dispute instead of a continental revolution. And without the celebration of the individual, the idea of a personal relationship with God might never have taken root so powerfully. It's a perfect example of how one great historical movement can flow directly into another, changing the course of civilization forever. Have you ever wondered how we went from a world of separate, isolated continents to the interconnected global society we know today? What lit the fuse for that explosive age of exploration, discovery, and, yes, conquest? You might be surprised to learn that a big part of the answer lies not on the high seas, but in the art studios, libraries, and universities of Renaissance Europe. We're diving deep into a fascinating connection: how the cultural and intellectual rebirth of the Renaissance from the 14th to the 17th century directly fueled the Age of Discovery and the subsequent rise of colonialism. It's a story of art, science, ambition, and the radical reshaping of the world. So, what exactly was the Renaissance? The word itself means rebirth, and that's precisely what it was. After the Middle Ages, Europe experienced a massive revival of interest in the classical art, literature, and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome. This wasn't just about digging up old statues, it was a fundamental shift in mindset. A new philosophy called humanism took center stage. Humanism celebrated human potential, reason, and individual achievement. Instead of seeing life purely as a preparation for the afterlife, thinkers and artists began to focus on the wonders and possibilities of the here and now they believed humans could understand and shape their own world. This newfound confidence was revolutionary. It encouraged curiosity, critical thinking, and a thirst for knowledge that couldn't be contained within a monastery's walls. People started asking, what else is out there? This explosion of curiosity had a direct impact on science and technology. The Renaissance wasn't just about painters and sculptors. It was also the era of Leonardo da Vinci, the ultimate Renaissance man, who was as much an inventor and scientist as he was an artist. This period saw a renewed interest in ancient scientific texts, like Ptolemy's geography, which mapped the known world. Although it was full of errors, it inspired a generation of thinkers to believe the world could be mapped, measured, and understood. This scientific spirit led to practical inventions that were crucial for long-distance sea travel. Shipbuilders developed the caravel, a smaller, faster, and more maneuverable ship that could sail against the wind. Navigational tools like the astrolabe and the magnetic compass, which were refined and more widely adopted during this time, allowed sailors to venture far from the coast with a much greater degree of certainty. The printing press, another game-changing invention of the era, meant that maps, navigational charts, and travel accounts could be mass-produced and shared, spreading knowledge and ambition like wildfire. Suddenly, a voyage into the unknown wasn't a suicidal guess. It was a calculated risk. But it wasn't just about a thirst for knowledge. The Renaissance also coincided with the rise of powerful, centralized nation-states in places like Portugal, Spain, France, and England. Monarchs were consolidating their power and competing fiercely with one another for wealth, prestige, and influence. What was the fastest way to get rich and powerful? Find new trade routes to the east, bypassing the Italian and Ottoman middlemen who controlled the lucrative spice trade. The spices, silks, and other luxury goods from Asia were worth their weight in gold. Renaissance-era rulers, fueled by humanist ideals of glory and legacy, saw exploration as a path to national greatness. They were willing to fund risky expeditions in the hopes of securing new sources of wealth and new territories to claim. So, when Christopher Columbus, a man deeply influenced by Renaissance geography, proposed sailing west to reach the east, he found a willing sponsor in Queen Isabella of Spain. She wasn't just funding a scientific experiment. She was making a strategic investment in Spain's future. This brings us to the darker side of the story. The same human-centric worldview that spurred artistic genius and scientific discovery also had a shadow. The European focused on their own culture as revival and superiority often led to a tragic inability to see the value and humanity in the non-European cultures they encountered. When European explorers arrived in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they didn't just see new lands, they saw resources to be exploited and people to be civilized or converted. The Renaissance ideal of the perfect, rational human was, in their eyes, a European ideal. They often viewed the indigenous peoples they met as savages or barbarians, a justification that made it easier to conquer their lands, exploit their labor, and impose their own political and religious systems. The quest for knowledge became entangled with a quest for gold. The desire to spread Christian faith, a key motivator, often served as a cover for brutal conquest. The Renaissance had given Europeans the tools, the confidence, and the economic motives to explore the globe, but it had not given them the wisdom to do so with respect and humility. The result was the beginning of the colonial era, a period that would enrich Europe immensely, but at a devastating cost to indigenous populations around the world through violence, disease, and the destruction of their cultures. So, when we admire the breathtaking beauty of Michelangelo's David or the genius of Leonardo's inventions, it's important to remember the full context. The Renaissance was a double-edged sword. It was an era of incredible intellectual and artistic flowering that expanded the horizons of human possibility. It empowered individuals and gave Europe the technological and psychological tools to reach out and touch the rest of the world. But that touch was not always gentle. The very same spirit of ambition, curiosity, and self-belief that created masterpieces also fueled the engine of colonialism, redrawing the map of the world through conquest and forever changing the course of human history. The legacy of the Renaissance is therefore complex and contradictory. A story of light and shadow, of magnificent creation and tragic destruction that continues to shape our world to this very day. Impacts of the Renaissance on Islamic art. We're embarking on a fascinating journey to explore a connection you might not have considered before: the surprising and profound impact of the European Renaissance on the world of Islamic art. When we think of the Renaissance, we picture Florence, Rome, Da Vinci, and Michelangelo. And when we think of Islamic art, we often imagine intricate geometric patterns, beautiful calligraphy, and vibrant ceramics. These two worlds seem distinct, separated by geography, religion, and artistic traditions. But history is never that simple. The truth is, these two great civilizations were in constant conversation, and their artistic worlds weren't isolated. They were intertwined in a dynamic exchange of ideas, techniques, and styles. So, how did this happen? It all comes down to connections. From the 14th to the 17th centuries, the Mediterranean Sea wasn't a barrier. It was a highway. Bustling trade routes connected Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa with major centers of the Islamic world, especially the powerful Ottoman Empire, which had its capital in Istanbul, as well as Safavid Persia and Mamluk Egypt. Merchants, diplomats, and artists traveled back and forth, carrying not just goods like spices and silks, but also paintings, prints, and, most importantly, new ideas. These weren't one-way streets. Islamic art had already deeply influenced Europe for centuries. But now, a new wave of European artistic innovation began to ripple eastward. One of the most significant impacts was the introduction of European realism and perspective into Islamic painting. Traditionally, Islamic miniature painting, which you see in beautiful illustrated manuscripts, favored a flatter, more stylized representation of the world. The focus was on clear storytelling and decorative beauty, not on creating a realistic, three-dimensional illusion. But as a Renaissance art, with its revolutionary techniques of linear perspective, shading, and anatomical accuracy, started to arrive in Ottoman and Persian courts. Local artists began to experiment. They didn't just copy, they adapted. They started incorporating deeper, more convincing spaces, giving figures more volume, and capturing more naturalistic poses and expressions. A perfect example of this fusion is the work of Gentile Bellini, a famous Venetian painter who was invited to the court of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II in 1479. Known as the Conqueror, was a true Renaissance manner scholar, a warrior, and a great patron of the arts. Fascinated by both Eastern and Western cultures, he commissioned Bellini to paint his portrait, which is now one of the most famous depictions of an Ottoman sultan. This single act was monumental. It introduced the European tradition of realistic individual portraiture directly into the heart of the Ottoman court. Suddenly, the Sultan wasn't just a symbol of power. He was an individual with distinct features and personality. This sparked a new trend. Ottoman artists began creating more portraits of sultans and high-ranking officials, blending the realism they saw in Bellini's work with their own rich, decorative traditions. This influence wasn't just limited to the Ottoman Empire. In Safavid Persia, during the 16th and 17th centuries, a period of incredible artistic achievement, we see a similar story. European prints and paintings brought by merchants and missionaries captivated Persian artists. You can see it in the works of legendary painters like Riza Abad. While still working within the tradition of Persian miniature painting, he and his followers began to incorporate elements of European style. Figures became more rounded, drapery fell more naturally, and you can even see attempts at chiaroscuro, the use of strong contrasts between light and dark to model three-dimensional forms. They took these foreign concepts and seamlessly wove them into the fabric of Persian aesthetics, creating a stunningly unique hybrid style that was both innovative and deeply rooted in its own heritage. But it wasn't just about painting. The exchange flowed into other art forms as well. Take, for example, textiles and carpets. The Ottomans, in particular, were famous for their luxurious velvets and silks. During this period, you start to see motifs inspired by Italian Renaissance textiles, like the pomegranate or artichoke patterns appearing in Ottoman designs. These were reinterpreted, of course, combined with traditional Ottoman floral motifs like tulip, carnations, and hyacinths to create something entirely new and spectacular. It was a visual dialogue with each culture borrowing, adapting, and ultimately enriching the other's artistic vocabulary. This cross-pollination is a testament to the open and curious nature of the artists and patrons of the time. Another fascinating area of influence is in architecture and decorative arts. While Islamic architecture maintained its core principles with its grand domes, minarets, and courtyards, subtle European influences can be found in later Ottoman palaces and pavilions. You might notice decorative elements that echo European Baroque or Rococo styles, which were the descendants of the Renaissance. This is especially true for objects made for the court. Think of things like clocks, scientific instruments, and decorative metalwork. European craftsmen were sometimes employed in Ottoman workshops, or their creations were imported and studied. This led to a blending of techniques and decorative styles, resulting in objects that were both functionally advanced and artistically unique, embodying the cosmopolitan spirit of the age. It's crucial to understand that this was not a story of one culture dominating another. Islamic artists were not passively imitating the West. Instead, they were selective and creative in their borrowing. They took elements that intrigued them, perspective, portraiture, a certain way of modeling a figure, and integrated them into their own artistic frameworks, which were still defined by a love for pattern, color, and calligraphy. The result was not a diluted version of either tradition, but a sophisticated synthesis that enriched Islamic art, making it more diverse and dynamic. It shows a remarkable confidence in their own artistic identity. They were able to absorb foreign influences without losing their own unique voice. This period of artistic exchange reminds us that cultures are not static islands. They are constantly evolving, interacting, and influencing one another. The story of Renaissance influence on Islamic art is a powerful example of how creative dialogue can lead to incredible innovation. It challenges our neat categories and shows us a more complex, interconnected, and ultimately more interesting history of art. It's a beautiful reminder that great art often blossoms at the crossroads of different cultures, where new ideas meet ancient traditions. So the next time you look at an Ottoman miniature or a Safavid painting from this era, look closely. You might just spot the subtle depth of Renaissance perspective. the hint of a European-style portrait or a floral motif that has traveled all the way from Italy. It's a hidden history, waiting to be discovered, telling a tale of two worlds that, for a moment in time, came together to create something truly extraordinary. When we think of the Renaissance, our minds usually jump to Italy, right? We picture Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel, Leonardo da Vinci sketching his flying machines, and Florence buzzing with new ideas. It's often called the rebirth of Europe. But have you ever stopped to wonder what was happening just across the Mediterranean in the powerful Ottoman Empire during this same period, from the 14th to the 17th century? Was there a parallel rebirth happening there? Or was it something entirely different? Tonight, we're going to explore the fascinating and complex relationship between the Ottoman Empire and the European Renaissance. It's a story of art, science, rivalry, and exchange that might just change the way you see this iconic era. First, let's set the stage. The Ottoman Empire wasn't just a distant neighbor. It was a dominant global superpower. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II, famously known as Mehmed the Conqueror, captured Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. This event sent shockwaves through Europe, but it also marked a pivotal moment for the Ottomans. Mehmed didn't just conquer a city, he inherited a rich cultural legacy. He saw himself not just as a Turkish sultan, but as a new Roman emperor, a Kaiser Rom. This ambition wasn't just political, it was profoundly cultural. Mehmed the Conqueror was a true Renaissance man, just not in the way we typically think. He was multilingual, fluent in Turkish, Persian, Arabic, and reportedly even Greek and Latin. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, and his court in the newly named Istanbul became a vibrant hub of intellectual activity. He actively invited European artists and scholars to his palace. Perhaps the most famous example is the Italian painter Gentile Bellini. Mehmed commissioned Bellini to paint his portrait, a stunning piece that blends Italian Renaissance technique with the Ottoman imperial symbolism. Imagine that the leader of the Islamic world having his portrait painted in the style pioneered by Christian Europe. This wasn't an isolated incident. Mehmed also had a deep interest in classical knowledge, collecting manuscripts of Greek and Roman thinkers, much like the Italian humanists were doing. His library was legendary. So, if the Sultan himself was so engaged with Renaissance ideas, did this spark a widespread Ottoman Renaissance? Well, it's not that simple. The Ottoman Empire was already in the midst of its own cultural golden age. It had its own rich traditions in art, architecture, literature, and science, drawing heavily from Persian and Islamic heritage. They didn't need to copy Europe because they were already leaders in many fields. Think of the incredible work of Mimar Sinan, the chief Ottoman architect. His mosques, like the Sulaimani Mosque in Istanbul, are masterpieces of engineering and aesthetic beauty that rival any cathedral built in Europe during the same period. They solved complex architectural problems with domes and light in ways that were uniquely their own. In the sciences, the Ottomans were also highly advanced. They excelled in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Taqi al-Din, an astronomer in 16th century Istanbul, built a major observatory that was, for a time, one of the most sophisticated in the world. He and his team conducted precise astronomical observations, rivaling the work of their European contemporary, Tycho Brahe. They were developing their own scientific traditions, building on centuries of Islamic scholarship. So, it wasn't about a rebirth of lost knowledge, but a continuous evolution and innovation. They didn't see themselves as catching up to Europe. In many ways, They saw Europe as catching up to them. However, the interaction was definitely a two-way street. The flow of ideas wasn't just from Italy to Istanbul. For centuries, Europe had been benefiting from knowledge preserved and advanced in the Islamic world. Many of the classical Greek texts that fueled the Italian Renaissance were reintroduced to Europe via Arabic translations. Furthermore, Ottoman technology, particularly in the military and in crafts like ceramics and textiles, was highly admired and sought after in Europe. Think of the beautiful Islamic tiles with their intricate floral patterns, or the luxurious Ottoman textiles that were prized by European nobility. Tulip bulbs, which famously caused a frenzy in the Netherlands, were originally imported from the Ottoman Empire. This was a period of intense exchange, not just one-sided influence. We can see this blend of cultures beautifully in Ottoman art. Take a look at their miniature paintings while they follow traditional Persian and Islamic styles. Over time, you start to see influences from European art, like the use of shading and perspective to create more realistic scenes. Artists were exposed to European prints and paintings brought by merchants and diplomats, and they cleverly incorporated these new techniques into their own unique artistic language. It wasn't about imitation, but adaptation and synthesis. They took what they found interesting and made it their own, creating a hybrid style that was distinctly Ottoman. So, why isn't the Ottoman Empire typically included in the mainstream story of the Renaissance? Part of it is historical perspective. For a long time, history was written from a very Eurocentric point of view, framing the Renaissance as a uniquely European achievement that set the continent on a path to global dominance. The narrative focused on the rediscovery of a Greco-Roman past that Europe claimed as its exclusive heritage. The Ottoman Empire, as the other, the great rival of Christendom, didn't fit neatly into this story. But as we look closer, we see that the boundaries were much more fluid. The Mediterranean was not a wall, but a bridge connecting these two vibrant worlds. In conclusion, the Ottoman Empire didn't have a renaissance in the European sense, because it didn't need one. It was already a flourishing civilization with its own powerful intellectual and artistic traditions. Instead of a rebirth, what we see is a dynamic and confident culture engaging with the world, including Renaissance era on its own terms. Sultans, like Mehmed II, were patrons of a global culture, drawing talent and ideas from both East and West. The story of the Ottoman Empire during this era isn't one of lagging behind, but of a parallel brilliance. It reminds us that history is not a single story, but a rich tapestry woven from many different threads. The Renaissance was not confined to Italy. It was a moment of global change, and the Ottomans were not just spectators, but major players in that. We're embarking on a fascinating journey back in time, exploring a connection you might not expect. We're going to unravel the threads that link two of the world's most brilliant artistic epochs, the European Renaissance and the golden age of Safavid Iran. Did the rebirth of classical ideals in Italy somehow echo in the magnificent domes and intricate tilework of Isfahan? Let's find out. First, let's set the stage. The European Renaissance, kicking off in the 14th century, was a fervent rediscovery of Greek and Roman knowledge. It was an age of humanism, where the focus shifted towards human potential, scientific inquiry, and the realistic depiction of the world. Think of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Brunelleschi masters, who revolutionized art and architecture with principles of perspective, proportion, and symmetry. Their work was all about creating harmony and rational beauty, celebrating the genius of humanity. Simultaneously, across the world, another great empire was reaching its zenith. The Safavid dynasty, which ruled Iran from 1501 to 1736, ushered in an unprecedented era of artistic and architectural achievement. Under visionary rulers like Shah Abbas, the was transformed into one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Safavid Iran is famous for its breathtaking tilework, soaring arches, and grand centrally planned mosques. It was an art form that aimed to create a vision of paradise on earth, blending spiritual devotion with imperial majesty. Now, you might be thinking, Italy and Iran are thousands of miles apart. How could they possibly have influenced each other? The answer lies in the bustling trade routes and diplomatic exchanges of the era. The Silk Road was more than just a path for silk and spices. It was a vibrant conduit for ideas, technologies, and artistic motifs. Venetian merchants, diplomats, and missionaries traveled to the Safavid court in Isfahan, while Safavid envoys made their way to the grand courts of Europe. These travelers didn't just carry goods, they carried sketchbooks, engravings, and descriptions of the architectural marvels they witnessed. Imagine a Venetian merchant standing in awe before the Nakshi Jahan Square, and a Persian diplomat marveling at the dome of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. This cross-pollination of ideas was inevitable and incredibly fruitful. So, where can we see this Renaissance influence in Safavid architecture? One of the most striking areas is in the depiction of the human form. Traditional Islamic art had often shied away from figural representation, especially in religious contexts. However, in the palaces of Safavid Iran, like the Shel Satoun or Palace of 40 Columns, we see something new. The magnificent frescoes decorating its walls are filled with life-sized figures, depicting courtly scenes, epic battles, and even European visitors, identifiable by their distinct clothing and hats. The style of these paintings is remarkable. While still distinctly Persian, they display a newfound interest in realism, depth, and portraiture that feels very well. Renaissance, the artists were clearly experimenting with modeling and shading to give their figures a sense of 3D, a technique that was the hallmark of Renaissance painters like Raphael. It is highly likely that European prints and paintings brought by travelers provided the inspiration for this bold new direction in Persian art. Another fascinating area of influence is the concept of the ideal city and centralized planning. During the Renaissance, architects like Filaret dreamed of perfectly planned cities built on rational, geometric principles. Their ideas emphasized symmetry, grand public squares, and harmonious. Now, let's look at Isfahan under Shah Abbas. He didn't just add buildings, he redesigned the entire southern half of the city around a central axis. The magnificent Nakshi Jahan Square, one of the largest city squares in the world, is a masterclass in urban planning. It's a perfectly proportioned rectangle, symmetrically flanked by the Imam Mosque, the Sheikh Lotfallah Mosque, the Ali Kapoor Palace, and the grand entrance to the bazaar. This concept of a monumental, multifunctional public square as the heart of the city has strong parallels with the piazzas of Renaissance Italy. It reflects a shared humanist ideal, creating an ordered, beautiful, and functional space for public life. Let's also talk about technology and engineering. The construction of the massive domes of Safavid mosques, like the Imam Mosque in Isfahan, required incredible mathematical and engineering skill, while the double-shell dome was a Persian innovation with a long history. The constant exchange of knowledge along trade routes meant that architectural techniques were shared and refined. Engineers from both cultures were grappling with similar problems: how to build higher, wider, and more magnificent structures. It's not about one side copying the other, but about a shared pool of knowledge that helped builders in both regions push the boundaries of what was possible. Furthermore, we see a shared love for gardens. The Renaissance villa had its formal, geometric gardens designed to be an extension of the house's architecture. In Iran, the Persian garden, or paridehiza, was an ancient concept representing a terrestrial paradise. During the Safavid era, these gardens became even more integrated with palace architecture. Like at the Finn Garden in they were meticulously planned spaces with water channels, pavilions, and symmetrical layouts, while the concept was deeply Persian. The emphasis on a seamless integration of architecture and a geometrically ordered natural landscape echoes the ideals of Renaissance garden design. However, it's crucial to understand that this was not a one-way street of influence, nor was it simple imitation. Safavid architects were masters in their own right. They didn't just copy European ideas. They absorbed them, reinterpreted them, and integrated them into a uniquely Persian aesthetic. The spirit of Safavid architecture remains deeply rooted in its own traditions. The use of mesmerizing blue tile work, the muqarnas vaulting that looks like honeycomb, and the profound spiritual symbolism of the designs are all quintessentially Iranian. The influence of the Renaissance acted as a catalyst, sparking new ideas and encouraging experimentation. It enriched an already vibrant artistic tradition, leading to a synthesis that was both innovative and deeply respectful of its heritage. The result was an architectural language that was cosmopolitan and confident, reflecting the Safavid Empire's position as a major player on the world stage. So, the next time you marvel at a photo of the chic Lot Fala Mosque S-Dome or the elegant columns of Shields, remember the hidden story behind them. They are not just monuments of a single culture, but testaments to a time when the world was becoming more connected. They represent a beautiful dialogue between East and West, a shared human quest for beauty, order, and perfection that transcended geography and creed. The Safavid Golden Age and the European Renaissance were two shining lights of human creativity, and for a brief, brilliant moment in history, their rays intersected, creating something truly magical. Transmission of Renaissance ideas to the Enlightenment, we're embarking on an epic journey through time, tracing the golden thread that connects two of the most transformative eras in human history, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. How did the rebirth of art and culture in the 14th century set the stage for the age of reason and revolution in the 18th? It's a fascinating story of ideas evolving, challenging norms, and ultimately reshaping the world. So, grab your thinking caps and let's dive in. Our story begins in the bustling city-states of Italy around the 14th century. After the long Middle Ages, something incredible began to happen. Scholars, artists, and thinkers started looking back, not to the immediate past, but way back to the glories of ancient Greece and Rome. They rediscovered classical texts on philosophy, science, and art that had been lost or forgotten in Western Europe. This wasn't just about copying old ideas. It was a rebirth, or in French, a renaissance. At the heart of this movement was a revolutionary idea called humanism. Before the Renaissance, the focus was almost entirely on the divine and the afterlife. But humanists like Petrarch and Erasmus shifted the spotlight onto humanity itself. They argued that human beings, our potential, our achievements, and our experiences here on earth were worthy of study and celebration. This new perspective championed education in the humanities, history, literature, and philosophy, believing it would make people more virtuous, more eloquent, and more engaged citizens. This focus on human potential and individual worth was a radical departure, and it planted a seed that would grow for centuries. And oh, the art! The Renaissance gave us masterpieces that still take our breath away. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael didn't just paint pretty pictures. They were scientists of a sort. They dissected human bodies to understand anatomy. They studied mathematics to perfect perspective, making their art incredibly realistic and emotionally powerful. Think of the Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile or the sheer human drama on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. This wasn't just art for God's glory. It was a celebration of human genius and the beauty of the natural world. This fusion of art and science, this intense curiosity about how things work, became a hallmark of the era. This spirit of inquiry couldn't be contained. Around 1440, Johannes Gutenberg's invention of the printing press with movable type changed everything. Suddenly, books and ideas could be mass-produced. Before this, a book was a rare, hand-copied luxury. Now, the writings of humanists, newly discovered classical texts, and even critiques of the church could spread across Europe like wildfire. Literacy rates began to climb, and for the first time, a conversation could happen across an entire continent. The printing press was the internet of its day, democratizing knowledge and breaking the monopoly on information once held by the church and the elite. This flood of new ideas inevitably led to questioning old authorities. The ultimate authority at the time was the Catholic Church. When figures like Martin Luther used the tools of humanist scholarship to read the Bible for themselves, they came to conclusions that clashed with church doctrine. His 95 Theses, nailed to a church door in 1517 and rapidly spread by the printing press, sparked the Protestant Reformation. This wasn't just a religious schism. It was a monumental challenge to a centuries-old institution. The Reformation shattered the idea of a single, unified truth dictated from above and encouraged people to read, interpret, and think for themselves. This emphasis on individual conscience and personal interpretation was a crucial step toward the Enlightenment's focus on individual reason. The Renaissance's thirst for knowledge also fueled the scientific revolution. Thinkers like Copernicus looked at the heavens and dared to suggest that the Earth was not the center of the universe. Galileo, with his telescope, provided evidence to support this, directly challenging both ancient wisdom and religious dogma. Francis Bacon championed the scientific method, arguing that knowledge shouldn't come from old books or divine revelation, but from observation, experimentation, and empirical evidence. This was a seismic shift. The universe was no longer a mystery explained by faith, but a complex machine that could be understood through reason and investigation. The scientific method gave humanity a powerful new tool to discover objective truth. So, how does all this humanism, the printing press, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution led to the Enlightenment? Think of the Renaissance as building the foundation and providing the tools. Humanism gave us the core value, the importance of the individual. The printing press gave us the means to spread ideas widely. The Reformation showed us that established authorities could be challenged, and the scientific revolution gave us the ultimate method, reason, and empirical evidence. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, thinkers known as the philosopher people, like John Locke, Voltaire, and Rousseau, took these tools and applied them to everything. If we can use reason to understand the universe, they asked, why can't we use it to understand and improve human society? They took the humanist focused on the individual and developed concepts of natural rights life, liberty, and property. As Locke famously put it, They argued that governments weren't ordained by God, but were social contracts, created by the people to protect these rights. Voltaire championed freedom of speech and religious tolerance, directly echoing the spirit of the Reformation's challenge to dogmatic authority. Montesquieu, inspired by the scientific idea of a balanced system, proposed the separation of powers in government to prevent tyranny. It was a direct application of reason to the problems of politics. The Enlightenment was, in essence, the Renaissance's human-centered worldview, supercharged by the scientific method, and aimed squarely at society, government, and morality. From the rediscovery of classical texts in a dusty Italian library to the bold declaration of "We the People," their line is clear. The Renaissance taught us to look at ourselves and our world with fresh eyes, to value our own intellect and creativity. The Enlightenment took that lesson and used it to build a blueprint for a more rational, just, and free world. It's a powerful testament to how one era of brilliant ideas can ignite the next, creating a chain reaction of progress that continues to shape our lives today. We're embarking on a fascinating journey back in time, not just to one, but to two of the most transformative periods in human history: the Renaissance and the Scientific Revolution. We often talk about them as separate events. But what if I told you that one couldn't have happened without the other? That's right. The vibrant, artistic, and intellectual explosion of the Renaissance actually laid the groundwork for the groundbreaking scientific discoveries that followed. It's a story of how art, philosophy, and a renewed interest in the ancient world paved the way for Galileo, Newton, and the birth of modern science. So, how did a period famous for masterpieces like the Mona Lisa and the Sistine Chapel light the fuse for a revolution in science? Stick around as we connect the dots and uncover the hidden links between these two monumental eras. To truly understand this connection, we first need to grasp the mindset of the Middle Ages, the period right before the Renaissance. For centuries, European thought was largely dominated by the Church. Knowledge was based on scripture and the writings of a few select ancient philosophers, most notably Aristotle. His ideas, while brilliant for his time, were accepted as absolute truth. There was little room for questioning or direct observation. The world was understood through a lens of faith and established doctrine. The primary goal of intellectual life wasn't to discover new things about the physical world, but to understand God's plan. This created a very rigid framework. Imagine trying to solve a puzzle, but you're only allowed to use a handful of pre-approved pieces. That was the state of intellectual inquiry. But then, something began to shift. A new wind started blowing from Italy, bringing with it a change that would eventually reshape the world. This change was the Renaissance, a rebirth of interest in the classical art, literature, and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome. Starting in the 14th century, scholars known as humanists began to unearth and study long-lost texts. But they didn't just read them, they engaged with them critically. This movement, humanism, placed a new emphasis on human potential and achievement. Instead of focusing solely on the divine, people started looking at the world around them and at themselves with fresh eyes. This was a monumental psychological shift. The new motto was essentially, "Man is the measure of all things." This focus on human agency and intellect encouraged a spirit of inquiry. It became acceptable, even celebrated, to question, to investigate, and to strive for knowledge for its own sake, not just for religious understanding. This newfound intellectual freedom was the fertile soil in which the seeds of the scientific revolution would be planted. The permission to question everything was perhaps the Renaissance's greatest gift to the future scientist. One of the most direct ways the Renaissance fueled the scientific revolution was through this rediscovery of ancient texts. Humanist scholars weren't just rereading Aristotle. They were discovering a much wider range of classical thought. They found works by thinkers like Plato, Archimedes, and Pliny the Elder, who offered different, often conflicting perspectives on nature. For example, the rediscovery of Plato's works, which emphasized the mathematics as the language of the universe, was hugely influential. This idea directly inspired later astronomers like Copernicus and Kepler, who believed that the cosmos must be elegant and mathematically harmonious. Furthermore, scholars began to notice inconsistencies and errors in the long-accepted translations of ancient works. This led to a new obsession with getting to the original source, the ad fontes principle. This critical approach to texts naturally spilled over into a critical approach to nature. If the ancient books could be wrong, couldn't the long-held beliefs about the physical world be wrong too? This created a healthy skepticism and a demand for evidence that became a hallmark of the scientific method. Art and science, which we often see as separate fields today, were deeply intertwined during the Renaissance. Artists were obsessed with representing the world as realistically as possible. To do this, they had to become keen observers of nature. Leonardo da Vinci is the ultimate example. He wasn't just an artist. He was a scientist, an engineer, and an anatomist. To paint the human body accurately, he conducted dissections, producing incredibly detailed anatomical drawings that were far ahead of his time. He studied the flow of water, the flight of birds, and the geology of rock formations, all in the service of his art. Similarly, the development of linear perspective by artists like Brunelleschi wasn't just an artistic trick. It was a mathematical system for representing three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. This fusion of mathematics and observation trained the Renaissance mind to think in a structured, empirical way. It taught people how to see the world with a geometric and analytical eye, a skill that was absolutely essential for the astronomers and physicists who would follow. The Renaissance didn't just change how people thought, it changed how they shared information. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 was an absolute game. Before this, books were copied by hand, making them rare, expensive, and prone to errors. The printing press allowed ideas to be reproduced quickly, cheaply, and accurately. Suddenly, knowledge was no longer confined to monasteries or the libraries of the wealthy. The rediscovered classical texts, new humanist writings, and, crucially, new scientific ideas could spread across Europe like wildfire. When Copernicus proposed his sun-centered model of the universe, his book, De Revolutionibus, could be printed and distributed to scholars everywhere. This created a continent-wide community of thinkers who could read, debate, and build upon each other's work. The printing press created a feedback loop of discovery, where one person's breakthrough could inspire a dozen more. Science became a collaborative, cumulative enterprise, all thanks to this revolutionary technology. Another key development was the age of exploration. As Renaissance mariners like Columbus and Vasco da Gama sailed into uncharted waters, they brought back more than just gold and spices. They brought back new knowledge. They discovered new continents, new peoples, new plants, and new animals that were not mentioned in the ancient texts of Ptolemy or the Bible. This was a massive shock to the European worldview. If these trusted ancient authorities were incomplete or even wrong about the geography of the earth, What else might they be wrong about? This constant influx of new, observable data fundamentally challenged the reliance on old texts. It proved that the world was far bigger and more complex than anyone had imagined, and that the only way to truly understand it was to go out and observe it directly. This spirit of exploration, of venturing into the unknown and trusting one's own observations, was the very essence of the new scientific mindset. The explorers of the globe paved the way for the explorers of the cosmos. So, let's bring it all together. The Renaissance wasn't a scientific revolution in itself, but it was the essential prequel. It created the intellectual and cultural environment that made science possible. Think of it like preparing a garden. The Renaissance tilled the soil by promoting humanism and a spirit of questioning. It planted the seeds by rediscovering ancient knowledge and emphasizing mathematics. It provided the sunlight and water through artistic techniques like perspective and anatomical study, which honed observational skills. And finally, the printing press and the age of exploration acted as the fertilizer and the gardeners, spreading these ideas and bringing in new data that forced old beliefs to be re-examined. When figures like Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler arrived on the scene, the garden was ready. They could look at the heavens with a new perspective. Armed with mathematics, a healthy skepticism of authority, and the belief that the universe could be understood through direct observation and reason, they were, in every sense, the children of the Renaissance. The scientific revolution didn't just emerge from a vacuum. It grew directly out of the rich, dynamic, and profoundly human-focused culture of the Renaissance. The rebirth of art and humanities led directly to the birth of modern science. It is a powerful reminder that progress in one area of human endeavor often fuels breakthroughs in others. The creativity of the artist and the curiosity of the scientist are not so different after all. They both spring from a desire to see the world more clearly and to understand our place within it. The legacy of the Renaissance is not just in its beautiful art, but in its creation of a world where questioning, observing, and discovering became the noblest of human pursuits. Have you ever wondered why we see the world the way we do? Why we value creativity, question, authority, or even how our modern cities are designed? The answers, surprisingly, often lead back 600 years to a period of explosive change, the Renaissance. It wasn't just about beautiful paintings and sculptures. It was a revolution in human thoughts that still shapes every aspect of our lives today. So let's journey back in time to uncover the incredible and often hidden legacy of the Renaissance in our modern world. First, let's talk about the big one: humanism. Before the Renaissance, the focus was almost entirely on the divine and the afterlife. But then, thinkers like Petrarch started looking back at ancient Greek and Roman texts. They discovered a world where human potential, reason, and individual achievement were celebrated. This was a radical shift. Suddenly, it was okay to be curious, to excel, to be a Renaissance man like Leonardo da Vinci, a painter, scientist, inventor, and musician, all in one. This celebration of individual talent is the bedrock of our modern society. Every time you pursue a personal passion, strive for a promotion, or believe in self-improvement, you are living the humanist dream. It's the philosophy that tells us we have value right here, right now, and that our potential is limitless. This new focus on humanity completely transformed art. Look at a medieval painting. It's often flat, symbolic, and focused on religious figures. Now, look at the Mona Lisa. You see a real person with a complex expression and a sense of inner life. Renaissance artists like Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael weren't just painting pretty pictures. They were dissecting bodies to understand anatomy, studying light and shadow, and inventing mathematical techniques like linear perspective to create realistic, three-dimensional worlds on a two-dimensional canvas. This obsession with realism and human emotion didn't just stay in the gallery. It laid the groundwork for everything from photography and filmmaking to the hyper-realistic graphics in your favorite video games. The desire to capture reality as the human eye sees it, that's a direct gift from the Renaissance masters. And what about the world of science? The Renaissance spirit of inquiry that humanists strive to question everything lit it to fuse for the scientific revolution. People were no longer content to just accept what they were told by ancient authorities. Nicolaus Copernicus looked at the heavens and dared to suggest that the earth revolved around the sun, challenging 1,000 years of doctrine. Galileo Galilei pointed his telescope to the sky and proved it, changing our place in the universe forever. This courage to observe, experiment, and challenge established beliefs is the very essence of the scientific method we use today. Every medical breakthrough, every technological innovation, every mission to Mars owes a debt to these Renaissance pioneers who taught us to trust our own eyes and our own reason above all else. This revolution in thought was supercharged by one of the most important inventions in human history. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press, developed around 1440. Before Gutenberg, books were rare and expensive, painstakingly copied by hand. The printing press changed everything. Suddenly, ideas could be mass-produced and spread across Europe like wildfire. The works of humanists, the discoveries of scientists, religious texts like the Bible became accessible to a wider audience. This fueled literacy, encouraged debate, and broke the monopoly on information held by the church and state. Think about it. The printing press was the 15th century internet. It democratized knowledge in a way that was previously unimaginable and paved the way for the Enlightenment, political revolutions, and the very concept of a well-informed public. Every time you read a book, scroll through a news feed, or share an article, you're participating in a legacy started by Gutenberg. The Renaissance also fundamentally changed how we organize our society. In politics, Niccolo Machiavelli wrote The Prince, a book that looked at power not as a divine right, but as a practical human affair. He analyzed what leaders actually did to gain and keep power, creating the foundation for modern political science. His work, though controversial, forced people to think about politics in a new, pragmatic way. In economics, the powerful merchants' families of Florence, like the Medici, developed sophisticated banking and accounting practices. They were patrons of the arts, yes, but they were also pioneering capitalists. Their methods for finance, trade, and managing wealth laid the groundwork for our modern global economy, the stock market, international banking, even the concept of investing in innovation. These all have roots in the bustling city-states of Renaissance Italy. Let's walk down a modern city street. The buildings you see, with their symmetry, columns, and domes, often echo the architectural principles rediscovered during the Renaissance. Architects like Brunelleschi and Palladio looked back to ancient Rome and Greece, emphasizing proportion, geometry, and harmony. They believed buildings should be designed for human comfort and delight. This classical revival has influenced architecture for centuries, from the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C., to your local town hall or library. The idea that our public and private spaces should be both functional and beautiful is a core Renaissance value that continues to shape our urban landscapes. So, from the art we admire and the science we trust, to the way we think about ourselves and our place in the universe. The Renaissance is not a distant, dusty period of history. It's a living, breathing part of our world. It was a time when humanity looked in the mirror and, for the first time in a long time, liked what it saw. It was a rebirth of curiosity, creativity, and the profound belief in human potential. The echoes of that explosion of genius still resonate today, reminding us to question, to create, and to explore the incredible world around us. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through time. If you found this as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more deep dives into the ideas that shape our world. Drop a comment below and let me know which aspect of the Renaissance's legacy you find most surprising. Until next time, stay curious.